All right. So we can begin, and I know it's getting all confused. We're like jumping all over the place. Just because one week we had Brian fill in, which is great. I think I'll change it to that in the future. So he's kind of a bridge to that. But also, since we kind of moved a week, so we're kind of all over the place. So for tonight, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Whether you're there or not, doesn't matter. But we're going to be going over 4 and 5 tonight, because that would have been the last 2 weeks. And then we're going to be going over chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Tactics, okay? And then the Bible verse, now that's the only thing that's kind of, we're up to snuff on. The Bible verse doesn't change because that is no matter if we're here or not. So really, if we're looking at, we're really in week, wow, we're in week 7. No. Yes. We're week 8, but really we're week 7 because Brian's like week 32 was put in as week 6. You guys, this is why you're the guinea pigs, because this is finding out, and sometimes there was some travel. So yes, we are 10:26, so we're just 1 week behind still in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and we're 2 weeks behind in Tactics. And that was obviously because not everybody had books, so we delayed that. So what I did too is I didn't want to do, actually we're just going to do 6 and 7 actually tonight. Because chapter 8 and 9, I'm going to combine next week. I thought if we had 2 chapters this week, we'll have 2 chapters next week, and that'll finish up the Columbo tactic. Okay, so really we were getting into Columbo 3 this time, which takes a little more knowledge because you have to know how to make your point. So it's, we had the first 2 Columbos, and we'll get into that. So we should be then, now week 8, so we should be almost done with Genesis. So Genesis 43 through 49 is what was due for this week, and obviously only 50 chapters. So we will.
Then we go to John.
Yes.
6, or we start at.
Oh no, then 1 through 6. So after we get done, so if you're looking at this for week 9, which will be next week, then we are actually going to be Genesis 50 through John 6. So start with John 1 and go through John 6. Again, it should equal out to just a chapter a day. Now, hopefully, if you're writing down questions, otherwise, even if you can't remember your questions, you're in the Word on a daily basis. Which, according to some recent surveys, is not common for people to be in the Word daily. They say less than, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, and this is from memory, so don't quote me, but I think it was only 5% of those who claim to be Christian. So these are not the whole population, those are claimed to be Christian. Only 5% of them read on a daily basis.
They read other stuff.
Not scripture. Well, and I don't know if they're necessarily reading Christian stuff, but it's hard because even if you're reading Christian stuff but you're not in the Bible, I think there's more deception that's come along with, teachings that aren't biblical. They're coming from quote unquote Christian sources, but Christians don't know how to tell. They don't know how to test the material. Like we have. So we'll just start with that, and hopefully my clicker will work today. Oh, the clicker works. It is working. So maybe this is going to be one of those days where everything, I shouldn't say it, works right. So really with the questions and the discussions, obviously we're dealing with 3 books. So Tactics, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and obviously we're going to start with the Bible. So why don't we start with any questions that you have going from Genesis 1 to Genesis 49?
How Tamar, the incident with Tamar and Judah happened, and then right away it jumps to Joseph, and what happens to him with Potiphar's wife.
Right.
Right.
And I think it was in a note at the bottom or in some other book I was reading it. You know, the position of those two happenings were, you know, for a reason, kind of, because Joseph.
Yeah, and I think and I especially like it, and this is actually one of the things that historians look at for validating or at least coming to the approximation of historicity. Because usually if you're looking at historical information and your key players are shown as being incestuous adulterers, usually it has a high level of, you know what, people aren't going to embarrass themselves unless this really happened. I think a lot of the times, especially in Genesis, I think God is showing that the entire group is just fraught with problems. This is one dysfunctional family. Because even going into Joseph, we see the dysfunctionality in regards to Joseph being treated differently than the other boys. Still, it was interesting. I was actually reading. I do a devotion that does Old Testament, New Testament, Psalm. Then it does a writing from the early church, and then it has a prayer and things. Treasury, yeah. Well, this one is called Pray Daily, and it's an app that I use. So what I was saying with that is, it's interesting because one of the laws that, under the various laws that Moses is given to give to the people, what they basically say is the second born, if the beloved wife is the second wife and the unloved wife has the first son, you cannot give him the double portion that usually the primogenitor is what they called it. The right of the firstborn had to go even to the unloved. And I think we look at the case with Jacob and what was happening with Joseph. We see what happens with Isaac. We just see that it is a totally dysfunctional family that God is using. And it's interesting. One of the main reasons I think that they put the Judah story in there in Tamar is basically she is in the lineage of Christ.
Yeah.
Right, and she's one of the only women, you know, her and Rahab are mentioned in Jesus' life.
Yeah, and so I think what we here have is setting it up so that we know the stories, so that when we get into when Christ does appear, now that, I mean, these were not Moses's thoughts, but this is something that he was inspired to include when he edited these portions, that they would be used to show God as the Redeemer of all. And when we look at, I mean, even today, when, you know, I remember reading through the Bible with Nathan, and when we were going through Genesis, and there were times Nathan's like, Dad, I understand, I got it. We don't have to go into any more detail. This was a messed up family, and but we see it with Lot, we see it with his two daughters, we see it. So I think it is put there just to show that Christ or God works no matter what the situation is. We cannot thwart his design and his plan. God had given dreams to Joseph. Judah had entered into an unclean relationship. And something was going to be born from that unclean relationship, but God would redeem it in the case that the Christ would come through it. Joseph had dreams, and all the brothers saying, we're not going to bow down to you. They did everything they could. They were going to kill him. They end up selling him. Against all odds, he becomes second. It just shows that what God has planned, no man can put aside, no matter what happens. And I think those are just some, points as well. Does that kind of answer? Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on that? No? Okay. So we will go into now just the first of the two chapters that we were going to read over the last 2 weeks, for I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So really when we get into this, and I love the quote, actually Brian has been watching a 23-part or 18-part series? 13-part series where James Tour had put out a video in regards to the current science in The Origin of Life. And actually, there was a book this last year that was World's Book of the Year. And it was actually an updated version of a book that came out probably 20, 30 years ago, reflecting on how little progress had been made in the origin of life studies. So they reissued it, edited it with new information, and it's called The Mysteries of Life's Origin. Yeah, or Life's Mysterious Origins. I can get anybody the proper title if you want it. But he said, really, it's kind of scary. We're worse off than we were 30 years ago in discovering the origin of life, right? Because it's something that's never going to be discovered. And in your book, I like the part where one of the scientists, actually Crick, comes out and he says, I will never write another paper because it's too much speculation chasing after too few facts. And that's really the position, because it's ironic, because what we have is we actually have the starting premise violates a law we know. The law of Genesis, biogenesis, that life only comes from life. So to even begin the process, they have to propose the law of abiogenesis, which means that life comes from non-life, but it has never been observed, it's never been created. That's huge, and I don't think people think about that a law that really is beyond dispute is at the foundation of violation has to take place, and something that's never been seen for this even to get off the floor. Okay? For even the hardware, for the software of evolution to run on, you have to have a violation of a known law. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, in watching this video series by this PhD scientist, he's going through the chemistry and everything. And he says, okay, you got to get the peptides and the nucleic acids and the amino acids, and you got to get these lipids and phospholipids. And he goes through and he says, okay, I'll give you this. Now, can you put it together? I'll give you these bigger pieces. Now, can you put it together into a living thing? And he says, I don't even think you can do that. Even if I gave you all of these pieces that supposedly have to come together to be able to put them together into a living thing, he says, there's a Nobel Prize
for anybody who can
sitting
do it.
there waiting
Yeah.
for anybody who can do that. And the challenge is out there, but with the laboratory technology we have today, he's like, I don't think we can still do it yet.
And it's interesting with what Brian just explained, actually it takes us into the tactics. One of the tactics is getting your opponent to agree with you. They actually put the pieces of your thinking on the table. So it's not you proposing, you're like, giving you this, you still cannot do it. But now we're going to switch, because they actually used his quote in regards to the fine-tuning of the universe. So we're going to switch modes, but I wanted to get that in because I thought it was interesting with what Brian, but he says only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God. It's interesting, in the Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis makes a similar claim where one demon is teaching the other demon, and he says, do not let them get involved with science, with really thinking about abstract things. He says, because we have lost people. So really, the understanding of science, and science actually comes, one of the presentations I do is called How Christianity Was the Foundation for Modern Science. Why? Okay, so it's interesting. So we're looking at divine design. So let's really go back through our 12 steps. My name is Scott Mauser, and I am a believer. But truth about reality is knowable. These are the steps, remember, in a step-by-step logical argument that if we look at it intellectually, then this can get us intellectually to the final state where Jesus is who he says he is, and he is the only way. Now, we remember that there are different ways to deny something. You can deny it for willful reasons. You don't want there to be a God, or for emotional reasons. So even though we can make an intellectual argument, does that mean we're going to persuade everybody? No, it does not. So we talked about these. These are the different stages we're going through. Okay, so the first one, the truth about reality is knowable. We actually talked about that to say it's really undeniable. And you can go back into the early chapters if you want to go over that. The opposite of true is false. If we can know things, then certain things like the laws of logic come in as well. Then we have like the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, the law of identity. And we can use those and come up with a very easy premise: the opposite of true is false. So if I can prove something to be true, then anything opposed to it is false. So we can know things about many things, including God. Then we started getting into the argument. It is true that the theistic God exists. This is evidenced by the last time we got together, we talked about what is called the cosmological argument. So that is the first. The universe came into existence. The universe is an effect. Since the universe is an effect, it has to have a cause. And that cause has to be beyond time, beyond space, beyond or immaterial. It has to have personality. It has to have free will or volition to decide to bring things into existence. It has to have a consciousness. There are many things that we saw from the cosmological argument. Now, we did it both from science. We gave you the SURGE acronym. So we're using what they believe about the universe to show that our conclusion is the only one that they can come to, that something started everything off, and that thing seems to be God, or at least a description of a theistic being. Okay, we haven't got to the God of the Bible yet. Tonight, first one we're going to talk about is the design of the universe. This is called the teleological argument, or the Theanthropic Principle. And so when we were looking at this, a couple of terms that I thought maybe you wouldn't know. Nanoscientist. What is a nanoscientist? Yes, they deal. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he actually is dealing primarily with small, I think his research is in the area of small micro robots that possibly can go in through like the blood system or other ways, and actually can be navigated to do complex surgeries or repairs. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, this is just fantastic. Telos. What does telos mean? Tech means end or design. To know the end of something, you know what its purpose is. So really, when we think of the teleological argument, it's the argument from design. Okay? So when we think about that, the other word, anthropic. What does anthropic mean? Think of anthropomorphize. Or, well, changing, but we're changing it in representation of what? Man. That's exactly it. So it's centralized around the reality of man in his existence on earth. Okay, so if we think of the Theanthropic Principle, it seems like the universe came about with man in mind. All the parameters that needed to be set were for a type of species that is doing what we do, thinking and analyzing, worshiping and following and discovering. It seems like the universe was made for such a being. And that's where we get the Theanthropic Principle. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So really quickly, the Theanthropic Principle, technically known as the teleological argument of the universe, or the fine-tuning, comes from the Greek word which means design. It goes like this. Premise one. And remember, when it comes to arguments, we have premises and a conclusion. It's called a syllogism. So if every premise is true, the conclusion is necessary. Now, we may debate or argue about the premises, but if you accept premise one, you accept premise two, then the conclusion is necessary. Okay? So that's why we like to get some of these arguments into little pithy premises and then a conclusion, so that we can know how we're arguing, what we're arguing, and it better shows the problems a lot of the times with the argument. So every design had a designer. Number two, the universe has highly complex design. And number three, therefore the universe had a designer. Now, This is a very simplified, there's other variations on this, but this is easy to understand. And I don't think most people, every design had a designer most people are going to argue with. We see it all the time. We're going to get into what is called William Paley's watchmaker argument that he came out in his natural theology. Actually, Darwin was studying this before he went on the Beagle. Interesting story with that. Okay, so that every watch requires a watchmaker. Okay, when we think about it, scientists are now finding that the universe in which we live is like a diamond-studded Rolex, something of extreme value, precision, and workmanship. Okay, except the universe is even more precisely designed than the watch. One thing I want to talk about tonight is I am giving the argument from the book, and again, we're making an argument based on what a Big Bang cosmologist would accept about the beginning of the universe. There are some of these points that I disagree with. When it talks about gravity as one of the anthropic constants, that is with stellar evolution in mind. I think there are immense problems with stellar evolution, and so I would not consider it as one of those constants that I would use if I was arguing from a young Earth position. But remember, we can argue from two positions. We can argue from the position they hold, and show that they have to come up with our conclusions because of their premises. And we can also argue from ours. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the universe is more precisely designed, and when we look at the combination in these watches, ironically, we're running out of the days when we have these mechanical watches. I always wear something from each member of my family whenever I teach. And so one of the things that I have here is Luke bought me a Mickey Mouse watch that still operates like that. So, but my iWatch obviously doesn't use the same principles, but extremely complex nonetheless. Okay, so it is the watchmaker. So the highly precise and independent environmental conditions, which are called anthropic constants, okay, make up what is known as the Theanthropic Principle. So it is a cumulative case argument also. A cumulative case argument is where you look at many different aspects. It's not just one thing, gravity. It's not just one thing, oxygen. It is the interrelation. And I love the analogy that they use. I think it's very apropos. They go in, and what they basically use, and that's a quick definition of anthropic, but they're going to use the Apollo 13, which I think is great to show. A lot of the times we need to be adept in the use of analogy. I have one gentleman that I read quite a bit of, and he believes that learning cannot take place without association and comparison. And so analogy is one of the prime ways that we can use, because for people to learn new information, they have to relate it to something they already know. And so analogy a lot of the times helps people with principles that they're not used to. So in this case, you're like, so there's a lot of things that supposedly, well, let's give you an example that maybe you can relate to, the Apollo 13. Now, most people have heard about it. Obviously not all of us were here, but we've seen maybe the movie, things of that nature. So the Theanthropic Principle in and of itself is a fancy rubric or title for the mounting evidence that has many scientists believing that the universe is extremely fine-tuned. And we're going to actually get to some of those numbers, he gets to them in the book, to support human life here on Earth. Okay, and really it's interesting. So when we look at the evidence and we're trying to show it, we think about Apollo 13, okay, the successful failure. Okay, it is amazing. Every time I read or think about it, and I love, and he uses it in the book when Krantz says, I hope this wasn't a government job. Of course, because the contractors didn't. But in the end, what was amazing, the whole catastrophe was caused by a 2-inch fall on a fuel cell that when they looked at it and evaluated, saw absolutely no damage. 2-inch fall of one portion of the entire ship, which obviously there were hundreds of thousands of parts, if not millions of parts. One was dropped 2 inches, it caused catastrophic failure. And if it wasn't for the amazing engineering of scientists and the intelligent manipulation of the things that they had at their behest, it was a death sentence. Just shows the power of the human mind and imagination. Okay, So that was actually a view of what the blast had done. Just amazing. Okay, so we're going to stop here and we're going to think about it. Okay. First, what are some questions? Did you have anything in particular? And I know, Pam, I didn't get this worksheet to you, and I apologize, I just thought about it. Did you guys use that worksheet by chance that I gave last week?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to know if you liked it or if you didn't like it. Didn't like it if you used it.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. Yep. So anything before I kind of hit some high points? Any questions that you had? Because I'd much rather address your questions.
We got one.
Sure.
You had mentioned that creation is very complex.
The creation is very complex.
Okay.
Yes. Because really, if
Who's it complex to? Us or God?
well, when we think about it, and I don't want to get too far off, because one of the theological things is called the simplicity of God, the unity of God. So God, as a concept, is not complicated, it is simple. And simplicity in creation, he spoke it into existence. So complexity, if we define complexity as multiple parts together that random chance and accident could not put together, then yes, it's still complicated to God. If we mean complicated in the sense of understanding, then it's not complicated to God, even though we haven't figured it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the watch.
Mm-hmm.
It's complex to us because we're not a watchmaker or a watch
Right.
repairman.
Yeah.
But to the designer,
Yep.
it's a lot less complex.
Oh, yeah, it's understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like similar to the automobile.
Mm-hmm.
To the average person, it may not even seem complex to most people. Think of a teenage girl getting a car.
Mm-hmm.
All she needs is this thing called a key.
Oh, yeah.
She puts it in, and if it starts, that's as complex as it gets to her.
Yeah. She has an operational knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you want, yes. And so if we're talking about an intellectual understanding, if that's the question, then yeah, this is not complex to God. Yeah. It is right in line. He understands every aspect of it. So very much. So we looked at this. So now, did Kathy have a question?
Not that I know.
Okay, then we'll move on and then she can stop me. Okay, so we talked about some of the what are some of the constants? Do you guys remember what some of the constants are?
Through here because it was a long time since.
I know you slept too many times.
Oxygen level,
Oxygen level, CO2
CO2 level.
level. Oxygen level, we're at 21%. If it was below 15%, humans would suffocate. You could have no higher order complex life. If it was above, and I think he put 25%, and again, I have not vetted these. These are things that we as Christians should vet, and we should see where the research, he notates it. But above 25%, we would have spontaneous fires bursting out, worse than we do now, except they're not spontaneous. Carbon dioxide levels. Now it's interesting because there's a lot of debate right now with carbon dioxide level because carbon dioxide is actually not a really strong greenhouse gas. Water vapor is more so. But there is still a point where if you have enough carbon dioxide, then you have obviously problems with greenhouse effect, the possibility, okay? But if it's too low, what happens?
Nothing grows.
You can't have photosynthesis. They need that to generate the chemical energy that really the biosphere uses as a source of energy. So these again are finely tuned. What are some other ones?
The transparency of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
It says if it was less transparent, then too much radiation would
Yeah.
come through. If it was more, it'd be not enough.
Yeah, and radiation to a certain degree is a beneficial thing. Too much and it wipes out. That's why even on the space station, they have to be careful because if solar flares happen, they have to have some protection because they don't have an atmosphere on the space station to protect them from the different types of radiation. And it's interesting because there's actually a study that shows that the decay rate seems to change and actually can be used as a detection device to help. Won't get into it now, just some interesting stuff. Okay, they also talked about the moon, Earth gravitational. If the moon was a little too close, then the normal tides would go over the continents twice a day. Makes it a little difficult for life, unless you're in Star Wars and it's Camino. You know, then you got, good for surfing. I mean, Camino in Star Wars, my kiddo tells me, is great for surfing. You just can never get off the wave. Or the opposite effect, we have stagnation. We have a lot of ill things. So we start seeing these. Now, does anybody remember how many Hugh Ross, he's an old Earth creationist, how many he has stated, at least in this book? He's added some more since then. Does anybody remember? He states in the book 122. 122 anthropic constants that are interrelated. Now think about it. When we were thinking about the analogy with Apollo 13, they had to shut off, but what was happening is when their oxygen tanks blew, that's what they were using to generate water. That's what they were using to generate power. They were using these things together so that they could make it when they needed it. Well, now they didn't have it, so it affected everything. They had to reduce the heat. They could only have a cup of water a day. And it wasn't able to power some of the systems that took away the carbon dioxide. Now it was going to become a lethal dose. 1 2-inch drop screwed up everything. So these factors, if they are out of whack just a little bit. Now, one thing that he doesn't really get into in the book, but it does in other presentations of it, these constants, we don't know why some of them are set. We don't know why the force of gravity is what it is. According to our knowledge, it could have been absolutely anything. I mean, along almost a scale that is unimaginable, but it's precisely where it needs to be. Seems arbitrary. No, it's not arbitrary if the end goal, the telos, is life for humans. Okay, so that's why we look at the end. Okay, he goes into many others, and we won't get into all of them. Talks about the speed of light, water vapor levels, Jupiter's being the cosmic vacuum to prevent us from getting, hit. Atmospheric discharge rate, lightning. If we didn't have the amount of lightning and nitrogen fixed in the soil, we would have massive problems as well. The thing that I want us to learn from this chapter is we have taken things that are extraordinary, and because we experience them every day, we see them as ordinary. We lose the magnitude of the complexity and the interrelated parts. I sometimes with my kiddos, I will go out and we'll walk. And I'll say, look at that butterfly. Now think about the butterfly. Think about what it's needing right now. Think about its eyes. Think about its digestive. It tastes with its feet. Think about all these different things. And before you know it, your kid's going, oh, we just think of a butterfly. Oh, it's pretty. It flies. We need to regain the idea of awe when we look at nature. And I think that would make a lot of people creationists. The complexity is just amazing. Calculation by Hugh Ross. Again, he is an old Earth creationist. Not saying anything about his faith. We disagree, obviously, on creation. But he basically said that to happen by chance for one planet to have what we have with those 122 constants, okay, and some of them even get into the point of, without a clear atmosphere, we can't discover the skies. And if we're not in a special place in the galaxy, if we're like near the center or towards the edge, we can't see, so we can't discover. So even our placement in the galaxy is set so that we can discover. so that we can grow. It's just amazing. But he says, so if we look at the entire universe, we have 10 to the 22 planets. Okay, so that's 10 with 22 zeros. That's how many planets we have to choose from. Okay? In that amount of planets, the chance that one of them has all of those 122 factors is 10 to the 138th power. There are only 10 to the 70th atoms in the universe. You have to have more chance than there are even atoms that create all of what we know and see. Really, that puts it at 0. If we're looking at probability theory and how probable this is, 0. Most of the time when I do talk to people that say, we don't care about probability, it had to happen because we're here. That's not explanatory, that's a cop-out. And you're excluding all other options, creation being one of them. So if truly there was only one option, that it had to happen naturally, yeah, I guess that would have a little bit of weight. But that's not the only option. There are, and he gets into this category, he says there are 2 types of causes, natural causes and intelligent causes. And they rule out intelligent causes, which we see active all around us, all the time. Okay, so really it's equivalent to 0. I love the last part of Arno Penzias's quote that he uses. He says, in the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. And Fred Hoyle said that basically his atheism was shaken with the combination of the argument that we have in chapter 5 with the origin of life and the fine-tuning of the universe. He says it shook his atheism. He actually said that it seems like a super intellect has been monkeying with the laws of science. Okay? It is profound. How do they answer this? How do they try to get around the total improbability, I would say impossibility, of this happening by chance? What is their theory?
They always add more years.
Huh?
They always add more.
They add more years, yes. So if we have so many years, it'll work, and we'll get more into that in the next chapter, but time. They want to add time. But what else do they need? If the odds are greater than all of the atoms in the universe, what do you have to do? You increase time, but you also have to increase what else? The theory is the multiverse theory. If you have an infinite number of universes, then one of them is bound to have those 122 or 130 qualities. What's the problem with the multiverse theory? Do you guys remember from the reading?
The law of averages doesn't apply.
No. It does not. What else?
Well, where'd that come from?
It's just a theory.
Theory. Can we prove it? No, it's unprovable. What else is wrong with it? Remember this from an earlier chapter. When we think of the Kalam cosmological argument, you may or may not remember that it was a philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe, and it dealt with infinity. Infinity in the abstract is possible. How does it relate to real world? Are infinite events, infinite numbers, are they a reality?
No, or we wouldn't, I don't understand it, but we wouldn't be here.
We wouldn't be it today. Infinites in reality do not occur. We have someone who has the quality of infinity, being unbound, but still that is one God. But infinites in reality do not exist. You can have theoretically an infinite number of points between 2 points, but you cannot fit an infinite number of books between those points. Okay, does that make sense? You remember that? So first, you couldn't have it. And then second of all, there's 3 astrophysicists that have come up with a theory that said, even if you have a multiverse, you still have a point in time that there is an absolute beginning. So they don't escape the problem. They just multiply the problem, literally. And so they don't get away from the cosmological argument. But again, there's no proof for it. We have absolutely no verifiable proof. We can't. It is truly a metaphysical claim. It is not. So it's interesting. It's kind of like when people go into ad hominem arguments. Usually if somebody starts attacking you, that means that their arguments are dead. They don't have anything else to argue with, because if they had evidence, they would just disprove your point by evidence. But instead, they try to dismiss you. I think the same when it comes to certain theories. Scientists going to the metaphysical, you know their scientific theories have totally failed. Because now they're going to theories that are unprovable. Okay? I think it's a great thing to think about. So, I remember going back to Romans 1, where Paul writes and says, man is without excuse. We are without excuse. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. There really is no excuse. We can confuse it, we can distract ourselves, we can try to justify it, but a real, oh, that's nice. A real intellectual assent is going to have to look at those things. Okay? So truly the heavens declare. You know, it's interesting. I'm going to end just this first part with Paul Davies. Paul Davies goes on, he says, one may find it easier to believe in an infinite array of universes than in an infinite deity. But such a belief must rest on faith rather than observation. It can't be proven, okay? So, with the evidence, it seems more that there is a volitional reason than an intellectual one to dismiss the evidence. Because they're not attacking us with, oh no, you have faulty evidence. They're coming up with, well, maybe we're not the only universe. So you have to go outside of our universe to try to find an answer for what we are finding inside our universe. Sounds like a cop-out to me. Okay. There are many good books. If you want more on the multiverse theory and how it breaks down and how it doesn't prove what they want it to prove and how it's unprovable, there are good books that do that. So I can recommend those. So there we will end with that. So when it comes to that chapter, so that's chapter 4, do we have any kind of other questions or thoughts? So that is one of the arguments for the existence of God. We've looked at 2 now, the cosmological argument, and we've looked at the fine-tuning of the universe, sometimes cause the cosmic teleological argument. Okay? So we will go on to 5 here in a sec. But really, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes. Now, Tactics, I believe, is a pretty easy to understand book. It's more the methodology. So we're not going to spend as much time with that. And also, I gave everybody, and Pam, next time I see you, I will give you the worksheet or the cheat sheet that I gave everybody so that you can put it in your Bible or you can put it wherever you would like. And again, Stand to Reason has great apps for iPhone and for Android. Now, we would disagree with Stand to Reason when it comes to creation. Okay, they are Old Earth organization, and we've talked and stuff, or at least when one of the members, Brett, but almost everything else, pretty solid agree on. Creation would be the only thing that we would love to have more discussions on. So the resources when it comes to arguments against abortion, arguments for the moral argument, other arguments that we're finding in this book, they have great resources and they're on app form. Okay, so when it comes to then Tactics, basically on the third use of the law, or not third use, shows my Lutheranism coming through. The third Columbo tactic, interesting. Yes, he is great. Except, it's hard because if you could just all of a sudden spice it up so it's high definition, I think kids would love it. But the definition, obviously, for some reason, kids are like, Dad, I just can't watch it. It's like it's in black and white. Oh, what a curse. Okay. So tactics 5 and chapter 6 primarily was 2 reliable rescues. So before we get into Columbo 3, remember Columbo 1 was the clarifying question, what do you mean by that? So if we're in a situation, again, the Columbo tactic is using information by asking questions to show people maybe problems or to get more information so that we can talk to them about their worldview. The second Columbo question was, what brought you to that conclusion? That's asking for evidence. So the first one's asking for information and facts. The other one is asking for a recounting of your route in getting why you believe what you believe. Was it because you read books? Was it because you did studies? Was it because you're a scientist and you've worked in these areas? That's what it gets to. Now, Columbo 3 actually now guides us into leading questions where we've gained information, we know how they think. Now we're going to show them by the use of questions why they're wrong. Okay? Where their theory comes into conflict with reality. Why maybe their facts aren't what they think they are. We can use it in many different ways. But before we get to 3, we get into what are called the 2 reliable rescues. You find yourself in a point where you're over your head. You now have gotten into a discussion where this person knows much more than you do on a given topic. Okay? Which is going to happen at times. We're not experts in everything. And so how we can gracefully do this is he basically calls, there's 2 rescues that we can use questions 1 and 2 on. One is called the professor's ploy. The second one is called getting out of the hot seat. So the professor's ploy is simply this. You are in a situation, it can be as an adult, as a kid, where you are at a place where somebody has the higher ground, if we're thinking of battle. They have the microphone, they can do certain things, they can shut you down. And all of a sudden they're teaching and they try to switch the burden of proof to you. They've just made a claim. Christianity is a myth. Christianity is based on fairy tales. They're resorted stories. And immediately, our first response is to object and to state why. Or even the professor may turn it on you and say, you know, if you ask a question, the professor may turn it on you and say, oh, I bet you're some fundamental Bible-believing Christian. Why don't you tell us why the Bible isn't a myth? See how he's changed. He made the claim. And remember, the person who makes the claim carries the burden in proving their claim. But what he has done is now, in a frontal assault, he's basically turned it on the person who is objecting. So this ploy is more to turn it back around. And so he gives the example, and he says, you know, do it something like this. You know, professor, I haven't stated anything about my beliefs, and my beliefs really would be irrelevant. I'm here to learn. You're the professor, and so I'm just asking questions because I need clarification. I'm not quite sure I understand what you meant by that. You stated that it's a myth. Well, what type of myth? So you start asking informative or clarifying questions. What type of myth? Okay, then you can get into deeper questions. Well, what brought you to the conclusion that it was a myth? Have you studied myths? C.S. Lewis and even Tolkien, that was primary pieces of literature for them in medieval literature. And so they were reading this. And C.S. Lewis is great. He said anybody who's read myth and fable knows that this is not myth and fable. And even to the point where J.R.R. Tolkien, because the purpose of myth is to help with understanding the universe. And that's why Tolkien said it's a true myth. It explains everything in the fashion of the Greek myths, in the fashion of the magnitude and the magnificence. But he said, but it's a true myth. In a sense that not myth as in fable, but myth as in explanatory power of a people's. So it's interesting, okay? So that's the professor's ploy. Don't take the burden of proof. If somebody's made the claim, make them prove it and keep asking clarifying questions. The next one is to get off the hot spring. Okay, I love what he says. Never play into the prove me wrong game. If somebody is saying prove me wrong, say, no, you made the claim. Why do you believe that? Just let me know. I want to understand your point. Be very gracious about it. Be generous about it. Okay? Getting out of the hot seat. This is really where you go from the persuasion mode to the fact-finding. What has happened is maybe you don't have your facts correct. Maybe he's bringing things up that you have no knowledge of. And so now you've gone beyond your ability to persuade because it seems like he has more knowledge on the subject and you may be not as well informed as you thought you were. So then you switch from persuasion to fact-finding. Wow. Okay, I'm clearly understanding that I've not read enough, or I haven't studied enough, or these are new things I've not heard of. Let me know. Tell me. Slow down. Take notes if you have to. Slow down and let me know what it is. Then you always end it with, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. I mean, not exactly like this, but thank them because they have given you a lot of information. Then tell them, I'm going to have to do some research. And then do research. And then hopefully you can set up a time to meet with them again. That doesn't always happen. If it doesn't happen, he suggests in the book, which I think is a great idea, have a objection notebook. Get a little moleskin, and every time you come up with an objection, write it down. If you don't understand, so objections you don't know how to respond to, then do research. And then remember, we talked about role-playing. How would you ask and answer questions? So the next time you come up with that objection, even if you don't get to go back to the person who originally brought it up, you will be ready the next time. Okay? So that is 6. Okay, so those are those 2 rescues he talks about. One is when you are facing a superior force, a professor who can shut you down, no matter if your arguments work or not. He can take the mic away, he can whatever. And the other one is when you're on the hot seat, okay? So chapter 7 was using questions to make a point, okay? This is the one Columbo tactic that requires you to have knowledge of the answer to the question. Because you cannot lead them to either showing that their reasoning is wrong unless you know what is the right. Now, always, always, always be humble enough when you state your position to show that you can be wrong, because we can be wrong. My wife tells me I do that more often than not. But we can be wrong. And let that person know that, yeah, if you can give me evidence, if you can do this, I'm willing to reconsider my opinion. But the tactic then is using leading questions. You know where you're taking the person. And so your questions are taking them to the target. And it's really, he puts the analogy forth as you are a bowsman, okay? And you're shooting arrows. The arrows are your questions. The target is the point that you're trying to get them to. Now, the point can be very different. You could be showing them that their facts are wrong. You could be showing them that their reasoning is wrong. You can be getting them on your side so that you're not really arguing. Okay? You can also use it to deploy those stereotypes. Give you one example and then we'll just cut it off there and leave for any questions for that one. But he said, think of it this way. He said the very difficult and complicated sociological questions that are flying around. If you have a neighbor that is one of these categories, we can think of transgender, we can think of maybe homosexual, whatever it may be, and you know it's a loaded question. Or maybe it has to do with racism or one of those topics that are flying around. And you are asked your opinion, and you know there's going to be kickback. So what you can do is you can, through the use of leading questions, you can set up the stage so that if they do call you a bigot, then they are also calling themselves a bigot because you have set the terms. Go something like this. So you have somebody come up and you say, you know, and I've had this at Grand Junction High School with some transgender kids. But but in the scenario, someone comes up and says, what do you believe about transgender? Well, the first thing we know as Christian is the first thing we want to make sure they know is Christ is a savior from everything. That these kind of things like homosexuality is on the same par with gossip and idolatry in the text that Paul uses. All sin is condemned by God. So we need to make sure that we are. Now what happens is when we get we get hit on a subject that hits what they think is their identity, then it becomes a personal attack. And so usually it can become more difficult. Now there's multiple ways that one of my leading questions that I do to totally avoid the topic, not avoid it, but put it in its proper perspective, is they'll come up and they'll say, what do you as a Christian, what does your God say about my being transgender? And I said, okay. I said, that is an important question. But let me ask you a couple of questions. First thing I usually ask is, if there is a God and you were a creation of his, does he have the right to speak into your life? And usually they're like, well, yeah, I guess if there is a God, he did exist and he created me. Yeah, I guess. Well, then the foundational question is whether or not there's a God. So why don't we hold off on your question of sexuality? We can get to that. But why don't we look at more foundational issues and whether or not there's a God? Because if there is no God, it doesn't matter what my God thinks about your identity. And I have now used a leading question. I've asked them to come on board. I've asked them their opinion. And now I've turned away from a volatile subject that probably would make it more and more difficult for me to express what the gospel is, because now there's barriers. So another example, say you don't have that possibility. So now what you can do is, so they come up and you say, okay, let me start with a question. Do you believe that people have the right to share their opinions? Of course, what are they going to say? Yeah, people should share their opinions. Are you willing, are you tolerant of people who have differing views? What are they going to say? We're tolerant. I mean, that's the buzzword. We're tolerant of people who have different views. Okay? So you see the road I'm going. Because now if they start accusing you of things, you're like, I thought you said that you were okay with people who have differing views. You may even go so far as, do you think it's right that if differing views are there, that you should be able to discuss the reasons why you have those views? And they should be civilly discussed. Yeah, of course. Okay. Do you, and there's many. He gives different ones in the book. But what you're getting to is then if they come out and they call you a bigot, then you can come back and say, okay, now you use Columbo question 1. What do you mean by bigot? Because you're going to be able to show that they had agreed to the terms of the conversation. We were going to tolerate each other's opinion. We were going to act civilly. We do believe that it's okay to have differing views and opinions, and we should be able to research it. Now all of a sudden, they've just rejected all that. Observers around you will see, because when you say, well, why am I a bigot? Well, because of these things you said. They're wrong. And I'm like, well, do you think you're right? Yes, I think I'm right. Well, I think I'm right. You can get into a further discussion. And basically it comes down to, well, how come when I express my opinion, I'm a bigot, but when you express your opinion, you're right? You start putting the stone in their shoe to help them realize. And sometimes leading questions can do that. Okay, so that's really what chapter 6 went into. He goes into many others. Some of them have the topics of tell them what they already know. This is kind of Socratic. You just have them answer questions. One of the Jewish guy that was talking to Greg on a plane or somewhere, he said, why, as a Jewish person, I believe in God, why do I need Jesus? So he started asking questions that he already knew. Do you think people who break laws should be punished? And luckily, this guy was a prosecuting attorney, and he said, well, be out of a job if I didn't. He said, have you personally done things that are wrong? Should you? So he used knowledge that the guy had and would admit to show You need somebody. You're guilty. Okay, turning the tables is one of them. He has many. Finding the flaw we'll get more into, and that is really how we break down some of those. One last thing he says, be innocent as doves, okay? Do not be offensive. Be generous in how we approach. Be willing to admit flaws. But also, if you stump or stall out, don't get frustrated. This is a new skill. Trying to figure out how to ask these questions and the 3 Columbo questions takes time and practice. Just keep persevering, okay? So we will take a break there. We're attacking ideas, not people. Yeah,
So then this isn't, and those aren't starters necessarily to start a conversation like this, like the tactics book necessarily.
They are. You can use them. The more and more you do, right now the worksheets or the surveys are more so you know. If I go on a campus, those questions are all in my head. I've used them enough or I've done enough, so I know where I want to go. I know where the contradictions will lie. I know that. So they are conversational.
So you can pick and choose.
You can pick and choose, and a lot of the times, like the Ethiopian eunuch, you choose what they are interested in. You find out where their passion lies. And then if you can help them see that their passion is invalid without Christ, wow, you got a good persuasive argument. But yeah, so it is. So yeah, I'm so sorry she was offended.
I just am not jumping in there and talking to people like I should.
It is harder. So maybe what you may want to do is maybe, and we can talk about it later, pick a question or two and just work on a couple of questions, digging in, and then it's more conversational. You can probably keep a lot of it in your head, because sometimes maybe the writing is what bothers people. So maybe just work on 2 questions, that you ask people. I love the creation, so I love, how did we get here? How did everything get here? And then the moral question. So maybe just focus on those 2 questions, or any others that you like. And then when you get comfortable with those, move on to other questions. It is harder. But I do use it as an excuse even when you're not in a class. I tell my students to do it all the time that have surveys. I said, if you want to go dig in, just say, I have a class. I have to do these surveys. I have to write it down. Would you be willing to help me? I won't put your name on it. No one. And we're just trying to, I just want to learn about what you think. Yep. So I do want you guys, and I can send this to you, Pam. There's a couple of things I have to send to you. This actually came out a while back in the New Yorker. And it is, what are the odds we are living in a computer simulation? Because the fine-tuning argument, we told you, or I talked about it, that the objection or the counter argument was the multiverse. But now the other counter argument is basically we're in a computer simulation. Many very prominent scientists believe this, even to the point that some of the articles say that we shouldn't talk about it too loudly because those who are operating it, which is us in the future, may turn it off. I mean, it gets into really some no joke. And these are in articles like New York Times. So I will put this at the back, so when you leave, you can see some of the ideas about living in a computer simulation. Okay? Yeah, which again does a lot to free will and everything else. But anyways, okay, really quick, chapter 5. We're going to move on, and hopefully my slides will all work correctly. Yes, good. So we're moving on now, and we're going to go back into, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Okay? And really, this is what is called first life. So this is the origin of life. So now this is not evolution proper in the sense of technically what evolutionists will say. Evolutionists say that their whole schematic of how everything came to be does not start until the first replicating system. Okay? Well, that's kind of like saying, we start anyways. But so a lot of the times they won't even discuss the origin of life. But that's a huge problem. Okay, and that's what we're talking about here. I love this from Ariel Roth. God never performed a miracle to convince an atheist because his ordinary works provide sufficient evidence. And I think that really is the point where we have made the extraordinary ordinary. And we need to start thinking. I remember blowing away a student of mine one time, and we were going through a Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. And so we were talking about some of the complexities. And so we were talking about the feathers of a peacock. Really, the color of the feathers are one color. What happens is there's a substance on parts of it that have similar to what we call keratin, and it's at certain depths and with certain refractions so that it reflects to the eye. So that feather is doing complex mathematics. And he was just so excited. And I said, yeah. I said, so it's even the colors on a feather are not simplistic. We have, certain levels of refraction going on. We have complexities upon complexities to give us the color that we see. We've lost the extraordinary and the ordinary. Yeah.
And with peacock feathers, they put a plucked or a naked or painted male peacock in there. And the females didn't even care. It's not a
sex
selection.
drive, sex selection.
The females didn't care whether or not he was pretty or ugly.
All right. No. So really quick, some quotes that you may not know. Luca, all capitalized. It's the last universal common ancestor. So you'll see it, Luca. They'll talk about the Luca, and that's the last universal common ancestor. Okay? This is something I want you to think about. What is life? Try to think of the characteristics of life. Think deeply on it, because it's interesting. Because we all know life. We know when we see life. We know what death is. But try to characterize it. And it's interesting, I think, some of the things you'll come up with. Okay? I want to make a quick distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution is change between species, or we would more in biblical language say kinds. So a cat does not become a dog. Microevolution, we do not object to. We actually call it variation within kind, but that is beak size getting bigger or smaller. It still remains a finch. Amount of fur on an animal, more or less. And, all we have to do is look at the dogs. Really, the huge amount of dog breeds we have only existed really in the last 400 years. They have been selectively bred for certain purposes. We used to have a dachshund, and I could see why that dachshund could go after badgers. Those things can be vicious, but that's what they were bred for. They were bred to go down holes, to be able to go for certain burrowing animals. Okay? So, very simple. Okay? Specified complexity. Complexity is something that is hard to duplicate when we think in the term he has here. So a mountain is very complex because the arrangement of the granite and the metamorphic rocks and all this is very complex. To duplicate it is near impossible. But when you have specified complexity, you have a complex thing, but it specifies something in its details. Giving an example that he gives is, you look at a mountain, it's very complex. Duplicate it, very difficult. Mount Rushmore is both complex and specified. They are faces of people we know historically. So there's a specification to them. And so they use that in some of their definitions, okay? Forensic science is science that is looking back to the past, that is being reconstructed. It is basically based on the law of uniformity, that the things today were the things that happening back then. So if you undermine uniformity, you really do a big problem, and we won't get into it now, but if we can show then, because of the principle of uniformity, that the law of Genesis or biogenesis, that life only comes from life, is the only thing that operates, we assume that in the past. If we can show that abiogenesis does not work today, then it doesn't work in the past. So we can use those things. Okay? Operational science, because a lot of times people will say creationists can't be good scientists. They confuse, it's actually a logical fallacy called equivocation, where they use the word science in two different ways. Creation science is a historic science. It's a forensic science. It's something that you research and you try to, it's a one-time event that happened in the past, similar to a murder investigation. We can't have the person come back to life, murder them again, ask some more questions, bring them back to life, let them get murdered again. You know, it doesn't happen like that. Operational science is what gives us our cell phones. So what they're doing is they're saying, oh, their forensic science says this, so they can't do now operational science. But they use the same word, science. The guy who invented the MRI machine, Raymond Damadian, young earth creationist. He does fantastic operational science. And there's even some people in the academies that say evolution is of no value, really, to science. Because the stuff like medicine and that, it's operational science. How is it operating? How's it working? The last time I heard that was a chemist. He was an English chemist that basically said it's a hindrance to true scientific advancement. It's not, because you have billions of dollars being spent on how did this evolve? Well, it didn't evolve, and now you've wasted a bunch of money when we could have put it towards operational science on things that we could look at overcoming. Because money is a limited quantity. Research is a limited time. So it really is a waste. Unfortunately, bad ideas give us victims. Okay? And a priori just means that it's something you believe in advance. You bring into the discussion. This is something you believe to be true. Now, we all have a priori ideas. The thing that is important is whether or not we can see them, whether or not we can test them, and if they're wrong, put them aside. Okay? So really he goes in, he says, this is not against creation versus science or faith versus fact. This is good science versus bad science. Okay? He really hits that. Goes in, he says there's only two types of causes, intelligent and non-intelligent. Everything that happens because of those two causes. So a rock falling off a cliff crushes a car. That's a natural cause. Somebody shooting somebody else is an intelligent cause. Not very intelligent from the standpoint of, depending on the situation, but we see that the cause is by an agent. And the thing that always gets me is if we have agents operating today, scientists doing different experiments, but all of a sudden the idea of agency in anything else, especially God, is automatically removed. Yeah. Okay? So really spontaneous generation is the only possible starting point for materialism. So if spontaneous generation fails, abiogenesis fails, evolution can't even get started. One premise. Really, the origin of life is that important because if it is proven false, everything else falls with it. Because you only have two options, here by chance or here by design. There are no third options. And if the chance is totally ruled out because of impossibility, you're left with a creator, and people don't want that. Okay? So spontaneous generation, it's either a brute fact, it's a just so story. They've even come up with panspermia, that we are seeded by aliens from other. I was thinking today, most people talk, whenever Brian does his astronomy talk, he says, whenever they need an explanation, there's a collision. It's a comet colliding. Really? In the idea of, the origin of life or different things, it's always aliens. So it's either aliens or a comet or asteroid hitting something. So,
It'd be like a Chevy and a Ford colliding and making Mercedes.
yeah, see?
That's ridiculous.
It is. Now, so panspermia. Now this is, I love this, from a physicist by the name of Yaki. He's also an information theory scientist. It says the belief that life on Earth arose spontaneously from non-living matter is simply a matter of faith in strict reductionism and is based entirely on ideology. There is nothing for it. Everything actually we have proves it wrong. Okay?
Would that be an exhibition of pretty blind faith?
Yeah, I think it would, because it actually goes contrary. What they claim we do, we go contrary to evidence. No, the law of biogenesis is pretty well founded. We've seen nothing that talks about spontaneous generation. Pasteur cleared that up for us hundreds of years ago. But you say that it has to happen even though it's never been seen. Who's going against reason? Who's going against the evidence? So I really think that is. And the biggest thing, and I think this, I'm definitely not prophetic, but information theory to me is the death of anything happening by chance and accident, because information and messages are only shared between conscious, sentient beings. Or, so when we have information in our system that creates us, that is information. It's the words in a book. Now, he goes into detail to talk about how complex the DNA of the simplest organism is and how many encyclopedias that would fill. The nucleus alone is a set of 30 Encyclopedia Britannicas, and the whole amoeba is 1,000 sets. That is specified complexity. That is not something that happens by chance, because we look at it and we can use the analogy straight across, because DNA is a language. So it's not a false analogy. We can say that it is equivalent to the book because they are using an alphabet. They contain messages, instructions, that if they're out of order, totally changes everything. And so that kind of complexity is just mind-blowing. I've got to get on with the thing so that we can actually watch it. So I hope this part, again, we went through the 12 steps. We're going to go through them really quick. We are now on the design of life. Okay, so that is the moral argument is going to be the next one. Okay, this is called privileged species, and again, Michael Denton is the one who did it. He also wrote a book in the 80s called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, and then he updated it, a couple years ago, maybe? Still a Theory in Crisis. But this you can get on YouTube. This is on YouTube, Privileged Species, but I wanted you to play it because I thought it was good. Go to YouTube and look up Privileged Species by Denton.
Okay.
And go ahead and watch that. It is, I really like it. He goes into detail. He's got some of the imagery as well. Talks about some of the things we discussed in the book, but he also discusses some other things as well. And especially as it regards we as humans. So it's fascinating. If I'm not mistaken, he gets into the complexities of water. I've seen a lot of videos around this subject, so sometimes I commingle my videos and think that what was in one was really in another. So I believe that is in this one. They'll also have another listing of videos that you could watch. So we are going to end with that. Unless we have some other questions. So I will just open it up for any questions. Obviously, there is a lot that we did not go over. Primarily, and again, I want more to answer questions. I think we hit the high points. But again, all this information is in the book or in the two books. So, and again, I will send it to you, Pam, but I do have, if you have something or you would like something that kind of gets the gray cells moving, as Perot would say, I do have like a study sheet that I give to my students a lot of the times that ask questions like, what do you think are the 3 most prominent points? What is something you disagreed in the chapter about with this individual? What is something you did not know before, like an aha moment? Why? So it at least gets things going, and it may help with conversation and with discussion. So, yes?
I have one question.
Yeah.
In the book, when he was near the beginning of chapter 5, he said, let's see, here, believers in this theory of origin are called by many names: naturalists, evolutionists, materialists, humanists, such, and Darwinists. In the remainder of this chapter and the next, we'll refer to believers in this atheistic evolutionary theory as Darwinists. This does not include those who believe in theistic evolution. Right. Would that be like there was a God, but now he just kind of set everything in place?
Yeah, it could be a deistic view where God put everything in motion, and there's so many different variations within it. But theistic evolution is usually that God started everything because we couldn't have the complexity without something, because the probability is so astronomically low, it's pretty much impossible, that God had to be there. So he created the situation or the conditions so that the natural laws could take over, and so God created through evolution. There's a lot of problems with that.
That's what would seem almost like that could be harder to talk to somebody in a way about, because you both think, well, it did start with God, but then.
No, but where would you go to then? What is the thing you disagree on? Not that there's a God.
If God's managing.
Okay, what is he managing?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, what is he managing?
Okay, well, what happens on the world?
Okay, use big terms. What is that whole process called for that person? How do we get from goo to us?
Well, you mean I'm supposed to answer that?
Yes. I'm doing a little Socratic, because I know you know, I just,
God began everything.
okay,
He said, "Let there be."
he did. So we agree with the theistic evolutionists that God is the starting point. What do we disagree on?
On what happened after he started everything.
The process, we believe. So what would you do to show that he is incorrect? You agree on God, so now what is the point you need to show is incorrect?
That he hasn't just let us go on our own.
That of evolution has not occurred. So really in that, it may seem different, but it's not a whole lot different from just a full-blown evolutionist.
They're still saying that God just created the little amoeba and then things.
Yeah. So we can say, if we're talking to a theistic evolutionist or someone who believes in God, then our main point is to show that evolution isn't adequate to do the job that he thinks it does. The same with an evolutionist. Or same as a atheistic evolutionist. We're still showing them the inadequacies of what they believe.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, you may also have to get into other areas, because it's kind of like you look at it, and with all the problems with evolution, you wonder why they attach God to the process. First, it is a hellish way to create. I mean, no pun in, it's just horrible. It's death, it's suffering, it's disease, it's cannibalism, all these things. That's what so then I would start questioning the character of God. Then I also would start questioning the historicity of a sinful nature. Well, when did we become men, and when was that transition point? So Adam and Eve weren't really real. Well, if Adam and Eve weren't really real and we have a whole band of people, why do we have sin inherited? Now, when Christ comes as the second Adam, it really makes no sense, because there wasn't a first Adam. And if there was death and suffering and pain before Adam and Eve sinned, because obviously Adam and Eve had to evolve, and the Catholic Church, and at least the last time I checked, in their catechism, basically believes that a hominid develops to a certain point and then God implants his spirit in a couple of them. So there's many problems. So now you have pain, suffering, and death prior to the fall. So now we have problems with Scripture. Now some people will argue, well, that's animal death. And animal death is not the same. I would say, yes, it's not the same, But I think in the scriptures, you can make a really good argument, we won't get into it right now, that the only thing that was meant to die were plants. And they do not have the nephesh that we have. We were supposed to be vegetarians at the beginning. Okay, but through the fall and everything else, and that's long. But animals, I don't think we're supposed to. But it also then brings in the question of, it brings in lots of questions. So this is where you could use leading questions. So you could use Columbo tactic number 3 to show them that if they believe in evolution, they have some major squaring to do with Scripture. Because what about the second Adam? Well, if it wasn't really an original sin, how did it get transferred to all of us? If it's not transferred, then how can this second Adam take the sin away? So you really do run into a lot of theological issues as well. But I think the first thing I would do is to try to help them see that evolution didn't happen, so why do you want to attach God to it when you have they're believing the science over Scripture, because Scripture is very clear about it. Even old earthers, usually progressive creationists like Hugh Ross, they do believe in an actual Adam and Eve. They believe more in stellar evolution, where things evolve, but then God proactively created species at certain times. So they did not evolve. They are placed there, but I think there are some difficulties with that as well. So it is hard. That's why we always should use Columbo 1 and 2, because people may classify themselves, but that's not really how we think of it. So the best way, so if someone would say I was an evolutionist, well, they could be a theistic evolutionist. They could be, maybe they only believe in evolution in the cosmic scale, but they're progressive creationist when it comes to species and stuff like that. That's why, and I always tell my students, if you meet someone who says they're a Buddhist, ask them what they believe. Because, even if you look at Buddhism as a whole, you have Theravada Buddhism, you have, Zen Buddhism, you have everything from atheistic Buddhism to, to plurality of God. I mean, you just, and so always ask the question so that we know what they believe and we're not using or fighting straw man arguments. Yeah. Well, we'll cut us short tonight. My wife will be happy. So for next week, we will be doing chapters 7 and 8 of Tactics, and we'll be doing chapter 6, which really deals with speciation. We'll be dealing with that. It's also, do we have intermediate forms, genetic limits we're going to get into. There's going to be a lot of things we're going to get into. Do chapter 6 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, chapters 7 and 8 of Tactics, and then the Bible reading, you should be through John 6. So you'll finish off tomorrow with Genesis 50, and then start on John 1 the next day, and by the time we meet again, you'll be through John 6, okay? And you'll see why I coupled the first chapters of John with Genesis. Many of you probably already know. Read this by next week. I want your opinion. Just kind of what your thoughts are, problems that you see with it. I'll put it at the back table. So why don't we end with prayer, and then we will be good to go. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you so much for the opportunity for us as believers to get together and to really try to think about these things. Lord, you are the God of truth, Lord, and we know that you are with us in everything we do. We pray that your Spirit would just guide and move us. We pray that you would give us a heart and grace and really to be innocent as doves to those who disagree with us. Lord, help us to withstand abuse and whatever may be thrown at us for your benefit, for their benefit. And Lord, we just pray that you would guide us, direct us in our conversations. Lord, help us to get into these conversations. Help it to be natural. And Lord, so that we can help people to understand who you are and the world you created. Lord, we thank you. I pray now that you would just be with everybody here. You would give them safe passage home. And Lord, to return to us next week. So we thank you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.